It's so funny because this is what, your second podcast?
This is officially my second podcast.
How did the first one feel? Not necessarily like answering the questions, but just like it's different, right? Because you're like saying things and you're being recorded, and this is kind of like just gonna be uploaded to the internet. Like, how was that?
Yeah, it's different than other experiences I've had where they just request my quotes, so they could put an article up or something like that. But I think it's definitely different with the voice, and then this one will be my first one with voice and video. I think you have to be a little bit more mindful of your mannerisms and are you speaking clearly enough. So, but other than that, I had a blast, and I'm really looking forward to being on your podcast. So thank you for having me.
Nice. Yeah, no, thanks for joining. It's funny because I've seen you on Instagram. I don't know how I've seen you on Instagram, but like you just like popped up one day, and in the bio it was talking about like, things. Well, first of all, you're a Latina in STEM, which is
Hmm.
right, but then talking about like your academic achievements, and then you look at your pictures and you have tattoos and your name is like Latina Powerpuff, and I'm just like,
Yeah.
who is this girl? And like, I just love her energy. I think I actually wrote you that one day. I was like, yo, I love this page, I love your energy. And
Oh,
then
thank you.
yeah, and then randomly I remember Odalis had you on her podcast, and I was like, yo, she looks familiar. So then I went to
Hmm.
your page and I DM'd you, and I was like, oh shit, I wrote her before. So it was just like meant to be.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's funny that you say that because she said the same exact thing of like, I don't know, girl. I don't know how I saw you, but I knew that your brand was out there. So thank you. It means a lot to me. I put in some work onto like getting my message out there and my brand out there. So it means a lot.
That's dope. Yeah, I'd love to get into that. I mean, let's get into the first question because it probably leads into your brand and like, that, what you're really trying to show to the world and the representation that you're trying to build. When people tell you to be your authentic self, or when you hear the word authenticity, which is kind of like a buzzword these days, like what does it mean for
Hmm.
you? What comes up for you?
Yeah, it is definitely a buzzword right now. But to me, what it means is not necessarily like overly policing yourself on how you're speaking and what you're saying and how you dress and all these different facets of kind of what makes us a human being. You don't have to be so overly critical, and that's just not to say that you can say and do whatever, like act a mess, but that you can just freely express yourself without having to put on this extra layer or this extra face before presenting yourself to the world. So I think in a nutshell, it's just, being closer to like who you are inside of yourself, when you're kind of alone sitting with yourself. I feel, I'm one of those people that I like sitting with myself alone. So I feel like I can be authentic with myself, and I try to show up as that same individual whenever I'm interacting with somebody else. But it's challenging because you kind of revert to always putting on that face or putting on that front or the brave face. So I try to peel that back and just try to be most authentic. So.
It's so difficult, especially,
Hmm.
I'm sure it's difficult in certain situations more than others. Yo, you said the word policing. That's an
Hmm.
interesting word to choose. Like, have you felt that you've had to, or you've been policed in a certain way around like how you present yourself? Maybe like even really
Absolutely.
early years?
Yeah. So it's funny because, well, not funny, but it's interesting because actually my mom and dad, I feel like, being immigrants, it was like a safety thing that they would say, when you speak to, certain kinds of people, you have to like speak in this way and, behave in these ways. So I think I started to gather from an early age, not even just in school or in the workplace, but just like at an early age for survival, this is how you kind of have to present yourself. Like you just can't act any kind of way if you're with your brother or if you're with your father. They're gonna suffer some consequences if you like behave badly or if you say something to somebody. So that's why I think I choose that word policing, because it's like a matter of safety and survival a lot of times, really.
What were some of those early things that you think you had to, you mentioned like being a certain way, you know what I mean? Like if you weren't
Hmm.
that certain way, then like there would be a consequence, whether it be for you or your family. Like, were there certain things that came up
Yeah.
for you?
Yeah, so just not drawing too much attention to us, just kind of fly under the radar, be really well behaved. I can just remember these instances of like when we would go out as a family or something, and we would kind of, my mom would have us trained of like, this is that you have to just, be quiet, do as you're told, because we don't want to get attention drawn to us. We don't want to get pulled over. I remember one time I was like throwing kind of a fit in the car, and right then and there, like just like my mom said, like we got pulled over like a minute into my fit. And I just remember that being the scariest thing because of how the police officer like interacted and engaged with my father. And that was, really traumatic for me at a young age. So then it was like, oh no, like my mom's not playing around. Like I really have to be this whole different, polished individual. Even from a young age, I was, that was that's kind of what I remember, and I have flashbacks to that. So kind of now when I'm with, my brother or my boyfriend, for example, I still kind of get those flashbacks of like, no, you can't just say any kind of thing because, we're people of color out here. They're not going to react in the same way as they would, a white person, exhibiting the same behavior. So
Yeah, yo, my abuelo used to say the same thing. He would tell me like, Pavel, reputation is everything. To the point where like he would wear a suit just to like go to a
mm,
bar, and I'm like, why do you do that? You know what I mean? But he made such a conscious effort to like dress a certain way so that people's perception would automatically be like, oh, he's a decent dude, instead of
mm-hmm,
like, who is this, like, insert terrible adjective immigrant guy.
right.
Yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
crazy. Tell me, and like, so your family immigrated, and did you immigrate as well? Like, like, where did you grow up? Like, tell me about all of those.
Yeah, both my parents are from Mexico, but I grew up in and was born in California, in Santa Cruz area, Santa Cruz, Watsonville area. So it's like the Central Valley, pretty close to the Bay Area. So a lot of farm workers, fields, a lot of rich culture too, close to the farm worker and the bracero movements. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm from. But it's it was such a stark contrast of like where the Latino folks lived and like where the white people lived. And it's like whenever we did have to go over there, it would be like this whole ordeal of like my mom would give us that talk, especially to my brother, of like, okay, like we're going over there and you have to act, you have to be nice, you have to listen to what we say, and we would not get those same talks like when it was just like us hanging out in the neighborhood. So
That's so
yeah, that's yeah.
So in your neighborhood, there was a big Mexican population, I'm assuming.
Yes. It was all my neighbors. It's funny, my family actually lived pretty close by. Like I had cousins 2 streets down. We lived right next to a high school, so there was a lot of activity around there. A lot of kids, getting in trouble and whatnot. But the paletero man
The
was
ballet.
always coming down. Yeah, so it was dope. I mean, I look back and I think back, like now my environment and where I am, it's so different, and I do miss that since we moved away kind of to be to go to a better school and to be in a safer neighborhood and all those things. But I am glad that I had that upbringing so close to my culture, so many immigrants. um, so yeah, that's a bit about my background, where I'm from.
That's so interesting though. Like at such an early age, you were like trained in many ways. I mean, like many of us were, right? Like
Hmm.
to like act a certain way because you're gonna change. Like what were some of those instances when you had to go to those places? Like was it to go to like a bank, or like why would you have to go to like quote unquote that part of town?
Yeah, it would be to go to that part of town mainly because we needed to get something like official accomplished. It would be like, okay, we're going to see el abogado, or we're going to go just different things like that, or to the doctors, even just anything really. My brother, he was diagnosed with autism at a young age. So all those resources and different things that we needed to tap into weren't readily available in our immediate community. So it was always like you have to drive over there and be in these big office buildings to get access to those resources. So that was a pretty frequent thing that we had to do. So that's, I think, a lot of that training, now that I look back, it really was like training. At the moment I was just like, oh, this is how kids grow up, it's like parents being parents. But I think now that I reflect more back on it, it was really just us trying to survive and not, cause any more attention onto ourselves, negative or otherwise.
Yo, now that you're telling that story, I think about my own experiences, not necessarily like going into the city, but I remember like, so my family's from Dominican Republic, and every time I would go on a plane, like my mom would like make me dress up. I'm like, looking back at that now, I'm just like, I would wear like, I wear like
Mhm.
sweatpants if I'm going to travel on a flight. I mean, pre-COVID, right? Like, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
yeah, like my family would like actually dress up, and like, you'll see like all these, you see a lot of like Latina women as well, like in heels and all these things, like super dressed
Oh,
up
yeah.
dudes in like suits or a blazer, like as if they're going to like an event, like straight off the plane. It's what is really interesting.
Yeah, super arregladas, as we used to say. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's funny. It was like definitely you had to put on like your best fit to go out and, just put on this impression to people, whether it was like, church or whatever it was.
Oh,
So I
church.
remember that
Yeah.
definitely.
Was church a thing as well, where you had to like present yourself a certain way?
Kind of not so much. I mean, my parents weren't, or my family isn't super religious. It was more of so like just to hang out with the fam, every once in a while. It wasn't a super big part of our upbringing. But I do remember that like people would make comments if somebody wasn't like dressed well, and it was like, oh, I don't want to be that person, that people are talking about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I know that like academics is obviously like a huge part of your life. And you even
Hmm.
mentioned a little bit of the story around like, you're in a certain community growing up and there was a school next door, but eventually like you went to go seek for a better education. And what was that experience like going to a completely different school? I'm assuming outside of your neighborhood.
Yeah, completely in a different town actually. We up and moved. And it was really because there was a lot of, gang activity, a lot of different things going on. That aside from just not having the proper resources that I think my brother and my family needed, my parents didn't want to worry about, our safety. So we did end up moving, and I was about 10, 11, and I just remember being so upset and not really seeing the bigger picture of like why my parents are doing this to me. I was just like, oh my god, like I want to go to school with my cousins and my friends that I've known forever here. Like, why are you just uprooting me and taking me to this foreign place where like most people are white and nobody can say my name. So for a while, I struggled with that, but I adjusted like kids tend to do, and I really think that it was in my parents' mind. They left just like similar to when they left their countries. They left their communities and their the connections and the friends that they had to kind of offer us even more opportunities. So looking back, I'm grateful, but I'm just like, geez, like so many of us have to do that, leave our communities just to pursue education because our districts aren't funded the same way that other zip codes are funded with property taxes and the way that things are set up, and it's just so unfair and enraging now as an adult.
Yeah. I mean, not even school, but I mean, in your earlier story, like to see the proper like medical care, like you had to
Hmm.
like go to another town, which is wild. And
Yeah, it just wasn't available.
I
Hmm.
think names are so interesting too because like that happens to everybody. What were some of the examples of people trying to say your name? I'm assuming
Oh
it's
man.
Ximena, right? Is it?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Ximena, but sheesh, I've had some pretty bad ones. I've had people say eczema, which is like a skin condition. It's like skin rash
Oh,
type thing.
I'm fully aware. I've seen so many
Yeah,
infomercials on eczema.
yeah. So now we're about to get them too because Google and everything, they're listening. But yeah, that one's probably one of the worst ones that I've gotten. It's like eczema, hema. It's like people
Emma.
get people get really creative. And instead of just saying, like Ms. Martinez or hey, how would you like your name to be pronounced? They're just bold and they just go for it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've said this story before, but it's to the point where like I go to Starbucks these days and I just say my name is Kobe.
Oh, people make fun of me because I use my sister's name, which is Samantha, and it's like
Oh, how
when
did
I look at my parents went through this progression with our names, it was like my name, my brother's name, and then they got to my sister's name. And I think they saw how much I like had to deal with the doctor's offices, first day of school, like it was just tough, man. So like I think once they got to my younger sister, they were like, we're just gonna give you an easy name, like so you don't have to deal with it. But Starbucks, I use my sister's name, or I'll just make up a name, you know. Like, yeah, I'll be I don't know, Jasmine for the day.
Yeah,
Princess
yeah.
Jasmine. That was my favorite princess, so that's what I go to.
It's hilarious. Yeah, something we just got to do sometimes. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I remember my friend told me, my homegirl, her name is Arlene. She said, she just said, Pabel, you shouldn't do that. You should tell them how to say your name correctly. Like if they could pronounce Schwarzenegger, they could pronounce Pavel, right? And she was like,
Mm.
if we don't train them, then who's gonna train them? And like part of me has that belief, but other times I'm just like, oh, I don't want to deal with this. I just want, you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know even to this day, in like my current coursework and PhD coursework, I have professors mispronounce my name, and I'll try to correct them, you know, 3, 4 times. But then if they just get to that point where they want to just keep saying my name wrong, I just have to let it go and just, you know, whatever. But I do try to push back. I remember when I was younger, I would just be like too shy to like say anything, but then I started standing up for myself and my name a little bit more. And you know, it works sometimes, and then other people, they just don't want to listen. So hey.
There's only so much you can do, right?
Hmm.
When was that moment for you when you felt like confident enough to even start standing up for yourself, or really just start like embracing some of who you were?
I think it was after college when I got into the workforce, really, because before I always had to deal with the whole like first day of school thing. And I would always know whenever the professor or the teacher was about to get to my name, because they would just pause and they would have this like really like this worried look on their face. And then, you know, some of them would just go for it and just spit out a name, and others would just say like my last name, you know. But I just always remember being like, that was such an embarrassing thing for me. And I would just be like, oh my God, just don't say my name. Like, I'm not going to raise my hand. I was one of those students that was just like, I'm just going to do my work and like get it done and leave. But once I got into the workforce, and I just started tapping into more of like my identity and just owning it and not being more unapologetic about it, that's when I started really like correcting people and just, or giving them an alternative of like, you know, my nickname's Mena, if that's easier for you, you know, Ms. Martinez, I don't mind that either. You know, whatever's good for you, just stop butchering my name.
Please, please. That's all I asked.
Yeah. Hmm.
Wait, so all right, so it's your like first day at work, right? Or your first like quote unquote real job.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, like you just had this moment where you were just like, you know what? I'm gonna start correcting people. Like what were you thinking at that time? You know what I mean? Like I would think like your first job, like you would have still been going back to those first days at like that new school where not that many people look like you and all of those things.
Yeah, I think I had a friend at work, and you know, bless her, she was a white girl, and she was like, you know, I really don't want to say your name wrong, and I know you probably have so many people who like butcher your name, and she made a point to like tell people like this is her name, you know, stop saying it wrong. So I felt like I had an ally in the workplace, which then like the more that I thought about it, I was like, yeah, like I don't even need you to be in the room, like I can just start doing it, you know what I mean? So but it was like I worked with only white people, like everyone around me was white, so it kind of felt weird, that dynamic, that power dynamic. But having her just do it a couple of times and be like, no, like, you know, it's fine, it's not a big deal, kind of, you know, inspired me, I guess, to do it for myself.
That's dope. Shout out to
Hmm.
her.
Yeah, shout out to her. She's yeah, she was my friend kind of throughout my corporate America, you know, struggle. We could bounce ideas off of each other. So yeah, that was cool. But I know that a lot of people kind of don't have that or may not have that, and they have to just, you know, try to navigate the workplace alone. So definitely I'm glad to have had, you know, a buddy in the situation.
Yeah. And I think I'm in similar spaces as you, although probably you're like a lot more technical than I am, but I'm also in tech as well. I work at Facebook now, although I just
Hmm.
resigned, so I'm going to another company, still in tech. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I feel you on like not that many people. I look around and there aren't that many people that look like me for sure. And I'm sure like the name isn't the only thing that you sort of struggle with. Like what other things just in corporate America do you think were just like really difficult for you as you try to embrace more of your identity?
Yeah, I think just this whole notion of professionalism, I know you talk about that, in your podcast in general, but for me, it was like everything about my identity was kind of counter that. It's like professionalism and its proximity to whiteness and like, able-bodiedness and all the isms, so it was just like I don't represent what this company or what these companies, these spaces consider professional, like I have the piercings, the tattoos, sometimes certain things that I say or not in their lingo. um so I have to like explain myself, or I'll say these little phrases that I like try to translate from Spanish to English that like people didn't understand.
Like what?
um
Like what?
I don't even know. I can't think of them. I mean, if I do think of one, I'll tell you. But just, those little sayings that we all have that we grew up with
Yeah.
that I would try to be like, oh, like I'm relatable, but it's like that's not relatable. Like, what are you talking about? You know?
Yeah.
But yeah, it was challenging because um I think corporate America is just a weird place. It kind of it's just weird. And I just was over it. And that's kind of, I know I talked about in the last podcast, but I kind of started to just rebel after a while and just say, you know what, well, I'm just gonna push the envelope a little bit. Like, I'm gonna wear shirts where you can see tattoos, and I'm just gonna show up to client meetings like that. And it's like, what are you gonna do about it? Like, are you gonna fire me? Like, that would be wrong. So I just stopped at a point. I stopped caring about the comfort of like the people around me, not altogether, but like professionalism. And if you really read about it, which some of my classes in my PhD program have me doing, and just it's just really rooted in white supremacy, and whiteness. So it's really to keep white folk comfortable, because that's just what they know, and so they don't have to think about what's outside of their realm. But I kind of started learning about the history of it and the history of all the isms as they relate to corporate culture and corporate America. And I really just started pushing back against it, of like, no, I'm gonna keep my piercings in, I'm gonna show up as myself, because who said that this wasn't professional? Some white guy somewhere along the line. So I really think I had this whole journey throughout my career, and now it's just like I just show up like this, and if you don't like it, well, sorry.
I love it. Yeah. I mean, if we're being if you polled like 100 people on like, hey, they had like a row of people on like, oh my God, choose one that looks the most professional. Like they're gonna choose the white guy. Let's be real.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
They're not gonna choose us, and that's what I think we've been trained to believe professionalism looks like, right? Like if
Hmm.
they see someone with tattoos, if they see someone with a beard, if they see someone with even something as simple as like curly hair, like
Hmm.
all of those things we've been trained to believe like that's unprofessional, which is wild and wrong.
It's wild and it's wrong. And like I said, it's just rooted in, it's just these constructs that like whatever's closest to white is most professional. Like you have to straighten your hair, you
Mhm.
have to cover up your tattoos, you have to look, act, behave a certain way. And I get it, when you show up to work, you can't just be acting any kind of way, or like unkempt and whatever. But these things have really been weaponized to keep people of color out of these spaces,
Mhm.
but because they don't accept who we are naturally, as we are, like how we came out the womb. So that's difficult, and a lot of times you have to kind of be forced to comply, because it's based on survival. Like you need to support yourself, you need to support your family. So it's like, how much of a ruckus do you want to cause in your workspace? How many feathers do you want to ruffle? Do you want to be that person? Like that person they label you like the difficult one. I was kind of labeled that, problem child. But luckily I was in a space where I could do that and I could push back, and I started seeing some of the culture change because of some of the things that I was bringing up and just doing. But I know that not everybody has that opportunity, and they have to just, you know, encase themselves in their identity and not show up as who they are. And that's exhausting. You know, there's research on how tiresome that is mentally, emotionally, physically. It's draining. Like, I remember talking to my buddy about, you know, my friend at work, like how much, how tired I was, you know, physically tired because I had to show up as a different individual, essentially.
Yeah, I jokingly tell people, jokingly, but like it's really true. I used to show up like I was a full-time employee, but I was also a full-time actor because as soon as I go into the door, like I literally put on my work persona. I'm like, hey,
Hmm.
howdy, sir, how you doing? Like all these kind of things, right?
Good
Like,
morning, Jan.
yeah. Like
Yeah.
what were some of those things for you? Like I legit assigned myself homework over the weekend to like instead of watching shows that I wanted to watch, I would watch shows that like my coworkers watch just so that I can join in on certain conversations.
Yeah, it would be like, you know, the chatter before the meetings start, or, you know, after meetings. It would be like, oh, what did you do this weekend? It's like, oh, you know, we went skiing, we went to the cabin, we, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, what? Like, I have nothing to talk to you all about, you know? So, and the references, like, oh, what do you mean you don't know that reference? You haven't seen this movie? And it's like, no, like, have you seen Selena? Like, I don't think so. So, like, you know, we don't have the same frame of reference. And so, like, similar to you, I think I started to try to learn more about some of these things that were kind of interesting to those folks that I could have something to talk about, because I don't remember them necessarily being interested so much in like my experiences. And it would
Exactly.
be like, well, you don't seem to care about that. So I'm just not going to really socialize with you. I'm just going to keep it pushing, you know?
Yeah, I said it before. It was just like I feel like we over pivot our enthusiasm. We fake it, but like they could fake it just as
Hmm.
much, but they don't. They're just like whatever. Tell
They
me
don't care to fake it because they don't have to, you know?
exactly. And it's so interesting too, because you know, even going back to that early example of when you know you were doing stuff in the car and you got pulled over, and that fear kicked in, right? And so
Hmm.
often at work, like we're fearful. I mean, let's be real. Like we all need to get paid.
Yep.
We all need to pay our bills. We got to pay our rents. We have to support families and all these other things. So a lot of us out of fear just like fake it. You know what I mean? Like I'm sure, and maybe I'm just making this up, but like I would be fearful that first time when you showed up to work, maybe with a piercing, and you would just like, you know what, I'm gonna wear a shirt with no sleeves on it today. Like, do you remember that
Hmm.
experience? Like, what was that like? Were you anxious? And then like, what was that experience at the office when like, I'm sure you got like one comment, the first one, and you were like, oh, this is why I didn't do this.
Yeah. I got some comments and it was just like, oh, wow. Like, didn't even know you had that. Like, you know, and then they would kind of start asking questions and, oh, what does it mean to you? And blah, 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 whatever. But it felt like once I started peeling back those layers, people began to get more genuinely interested and curious about me. But it was like, wow, like I really had to do this, like take an actual stand against this for you all to like take an interest in me as an individual, not just me representing like a monolith of culture, you know? So yeah, it was a weird experience, but definitely got some comments. And I remember in particular, one supervisor I had, she was not very supportive. She was, you know, kind of she was a white woman, and her and I didn't have a lot to relate to. I didn't really see her as like somebody who was kind of guiding my career in the right place. And I just remember a lot of snide remarks on her part of like, oh, like interesting choice for a client meeting, you know, things like that, where it would just be like, okay, I don't even care what you have to say anymore, you know. So yeah, her and I kind of had an interesting relationship, but it's those weird things where you have to think about like, am I willing to do this? Because she has the power to, you know, terminate me. So, or to, you know, if she speaks out about it enough, so they could try to reprimand me, you know. But luckily that didn't happen, and I started to get more allies in the workplace the more vocal that I was. But like I keep saying, not everybody has that. So I think that just speaks to the structural problems in corporate America and how people of color are not supported properly.
Yeah. What do you think some of those structural problems are, or maybe like were some of those structural things that you experienced?
Well, working in corporate responsibility and like a lot of DE&I efforts, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, I just know that for a lot of companies that I've worked with, and even now, we see that that's not you know, it's not a core piece of the business. It's not like, oh, accounting, finance,
Mhm.
marketing, DEI, or like some kind of, people try to lump it under like HR or
Mhm.
the people teams, whatever. But although it has some overlap with HR, structurally, it should be a different component of the business, in my opinion, that can just plug into all the other, work with all the other parts of the business. Because when that happens, you can see that a company actually values that, and they're putting their money where their mouth is, and they're hiring people and trying to make structural changes in the company to reflect that. And if you're a small company or if you're a big company, you can have a department of one or you can have teams of people. But I think it really says a lot if you make that concerted effort to be like, okay, this is important to us. We're going to actually have a budget, just like if it were accounting, if it were marketing, not just like a little side thing that we're going to throw at our HR people, or form, a DEI committee of our people that are already underpaid or overworked.
Mhm.
Just get the 5 people of color, and just get them to form a committee, but we're not going to pay them for it. We're going to exploit them. And now I'm off on a tangent, but I think
No, no, no. It's
structurally
good.
that's what people need to realize who are running these companies. Like, we see you.
Yeah. I mean, it's wild because where I work, I don't remember when exactly, but at one point, diversity is always a conversation at every company, right? But at one point, they actually made a structural change where managers were being graded on diversity and inclusion. Um,
Mm,
and after like now it's going to be on their performance review, shit shifted so fast to the point where
mm-hmm.
like you couldn't have a meeting without having diversity and inclusion being talked about. So it's funny, like when people talk about like, yeah, we always cared about it, blah blah blah. Yeah, sure, but not enough until you're being paid on it, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And there was even,
Yeah.
I think NASDAQ, was it, they're giving like every company that's listed on the NASDAQ, I forget what exchange it is, I think it's NASDAQ though, but they're mandating that all of their every company that's listed there have like a certain number of women on their board and people of color on their board. And like that structural shit is actually going to drive change. You know what I mean? Because they're making people, because it's going to affect their money.
Exactly. Once it affects the bottom line, if you don't like factor that into the system, people are not just going to do it just, for funsies or because they care enough
For
about it.
funsies.
Yeah, like they're just not going to do it, unfortunately. But once you put it in people, it affects people's pay structure, it affects people's like upward mobility,
Oh.
and it's not just quotas to meet quotas. Like, people,
Mhm.
I think, are now finally realizing how, diversity is beneficial in a business. Like, you don't want to be that company that puts something out and it's like, oh my god, did nobody in that room like see what was the blatant issue with this,
Oh
you
God, yeah.
know
So
like.
many
And it's
examples.
so many examples that we've seen of that. So it's like, and it's also long term, like with retention, you lose a lot of talent and you lose really great people because you don't support them, or because you just blatantly, there's just blatantly racist, sexist, ableist practices. So they're forced to go where they're valued. Like, if you don't value them, they're going to go elsewhere.
Yeah, yeah. No, 100% agree. And it's so dope too, because when you started being more of yourself and embracing your identity, I think you mentioned that other people started doing the same, right? And like culture
Hmm.
started changing. Like, tell me a little bit about that. Like, what were some of the things that you started seeing shift as you started like embracing more of yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think other people started kind of being more comfortable and just sharing certain things about themselves openly. Um, I know for a fact that, people on my direct team, they kind of took a notice about that, and they were commending me for it. But it kind of was this weird place where it was like, I don't need to be commended for doing this. It's like, I just want you all to like change your behaviors.
Like they're
So
commending you just for being you, which is kind of weird.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of weird, yeah. But I mean, it's better, I guess, than what was happening before. But yeah, some of those cultural things started to shift. I started seeing some things in like hiring practices or just interviewing practices, in the language of what's it called, job descriptions. some of those things we were pointing out, this is not okay. This might, detract somebody who's a really great, you know, person for the job, but because you have this language in here, they might not want to, or they might not feel like they're fit for the job. So just certain things like that, bringing those into the conversation, I started noticing what's happening. And another thing too is that I noticed that I was always getting brought into certain conversations that's like, oh, well, what's like the woman of color perspective, or what's the Latina perspective? And I think once I started being vocal about like, well, ma'am, why do you feel the need to like ask me that? Like, really examine, do you care about my opinion as an individual, or are you just trying to check a box and say, because we don't have anybody else, like I'm just going to you and taking you away from your work so that you can consult with me on like people of color, or what, Latinas or Latinos or whatever. So I found that once I started challenging some of those things, like people's like framework like started to change. They would kind of question, and I would see that less and less. So
I
that's a
love
good
that.
outcome.
I love that. I love how much you've grown and now you're just like pushing and asking those questions. Like,
Hmm.
is it the same for you where you feel a level of like I'm one of the only Latinos in the office. Well, what it used to be the office.
Yeah.
But like for me, I put this pressure on myself where I tell myself like in a way like I'm representing all of us. Like they're only gonna hire the next one if I
Hmm.
do a good job. You know what I mean? Like they may not hire another Latino if I don't do a good job. You know what I mean? Like do you feel that
Yes.
sense of pressure as well?
100%.
Really? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So whether I'm in class, in my master's program, I was the only Latinx person to
Yeah.
go through my whole program, and one of, three women. So it was always this pressure, whether academically or, um, professionally in the workplace, of like, I have to just represent, and I can't have an off day. I can't have like a vulnerable moment, because I have to literally put on for like my entire, just everyone who might look like me or relate to me, because, I'm their only reference for what somebody like me is, unfortunately,
Hmm.
because I was recently rereading the book White Fragility, and it's by, a white woman who's trying to speak to white people, and get them to examine their biases. So she was kind of talking about how, for a lot of white people, they don't examine critically how everybody around them is just white, and they just surround themselves with whiteness, and they use, the one person that they know as, the black person or the Hispanic person or Latin whatever, and like that's their entire frame of reference for what that culture or that ethnic group or whatever is like. And so getting them to like critically examine why they feel the need to do that, and why they haven't felt the need to diversify the folks around them, whether it's their friends, their neighborhoods, academically or professionally. So that's something that I'm trying to like learn more about. But yeah, it's a whole thing that we could have a whole nother podcast about.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and it's interesting that you also feel that. I'm sure a lot of people do as well, but obviously it's unfortunate because in many ways like we put that pressure on ourselves, you know what I mean? Like no one's
Hmm.
necessarily telling us like
Yeah.
you're the voice for every Latinx person in the world, right? But we put that pressure on ourselves. Um
Definitely. Yeah,
it's
I don't want to be like the reason why somebody thinks, oh, like,
you know,
that's why we don't have more of you around, is because you're difficult, or because you're loud, or because whatever, you know.
right. Are
So
those is that what you've been called before?
not outwardly, but you can kind of sense that, what I sense, that people thought that I was a bit challenging to work with or difficult to work with, because of some of these questions that I would raise. So then it was just like, do I want to keep doing this, like, do I want to be known as like that person? And I think I was doing it at a time where this conversation wasn't at the forefront. I think now with the uprisings, a lot of this language and a lot of these concepts are more, you know, part of conversations that in spaces that they weren't, even just a few years ago. So I think that was a time when it really was like, I could, you know, this could really affect like my money. This could really affect my career and whatever. But at that point, I was just like, this is important to me. And it kind of evolved into my whole brand and what I stand for now. So I
Yeah.
have no regrets.
Nah, I love it. And it's always it's always interesting seeing like if we're called difficult to work with is like the equivalent of a white dude being called like a change agent or like a
Mm.
disruptor. You know what I mean? And like
Oh,
an out
yeah.
of the box thinker. Meanwhile, like we ask too many questions. We're like too aggressive, and all those things, which
Hmm.
is that shit drives me crazy.
It would drive me nuts when I would have this idea and then, at a meeting, and then some white man or white guy, 5-10 minutes later would kind of just regurgitate what I said, and then it'd be like, wonderful idea, so and so, like, let's write that down, or like, let's jot that down to work on that. And I would just be like looking around like, are you serious? But that happened to me enough times to where it was just like, oh my god, like, I don't even care, I'm just glad it's getting done.
It drives me crazy. I'm like, yo, I literally just said that.
Yeah. And I think it's difficult when I would try to have these real conversations with like my white coworkers who were in the same like position as me. They wouldn't really see it in the beginning, but then once I started talking to them about it, they would be like, wow. And they, luckily they also started standing up for me, and we would just stand up for each other and be like, actually, Ximena said that, we just
Ooh.
want to make sure we're like attributing proper credit, but also so and so, like, glad you're also enthusiastic about that. Like, there are just certain ways where you could stand up for each other without it being like blow up the whole spot, like that was my idea, how dare you? Because at the end of the day, you still need a job.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that 100%. But like, it's wild that you even had to go to that extent. Like, you probably had to schedule a separate meeting just to like, first of all, you had to find people you trusted, then
Yes, that was hard.
schedule a separate meeting with them, explain it to them probably a couple of times. Then you had to wait for a few meetings to show them examples on like how you did it, and like
Hmm.
so that they didn't think you were crazy.
Yeah,
And then hopefully they believed
exactly.
you. And then the fact that they even stood up for you, that almost never happens.
That almost never happens. Yeah. So thank goodness that it did. But it was after months and months of like, this is how, just differences that I would notice in how, because we had the same supervisor, and how like she would treat me and my ideas and my way of working versus like theirs. And it wasn't until I just started telling them about it that they could pick it up and see it, and even, doing something about it.
Yeah.
Because that's where I think change can start to happen. Because if I'm just the one complaining about it to my supervisor, she's gonna again label me as the difficult one even more so. But if
Mhm.
other people are kind of calling it out and it starts to affect like her position in the company, then it's when it's like, oh, it's important for me to change my behavior.
Exactly. And I'm sure all of that experience led you to building or creating this brand that really is
Hmm.
you. You know what I mean? Or like
Yeah.
like why is creating that representation, which is you, so important to you?
It's important to me because it's not something that I really saw like growing up as being valued, or as, you know, it would always just be one thing that like Latinas were painted as. And it was just the lack of representation, number one, but then also the misrepresentation, which at sometimes can be even more damaging. So now we look at the research, and how important it is for people, kids, young people, to see themselves, depicted, to see their stories, to see somebody who's just not one dimensional as a character. Like, they really have depth, and they're not stereotypical. So I think a lot of that, and especially crossing over into like science communication and like tech, world, um, I just wanted to be that person that I needed, when it was like, I don't look like Bill Nye or like all these other, like all my idols, like science people. But like, I want to, kind of represent that for somebody else, hopefully. So that's what it's about, really. That's how it started.
I love that. And you are being seen because I saw you and what you represented and I was like, this girl's dope. I gotta talk to her.
Thank you. Yeah. So I mean, I think that's what really keeps me going is like sometimes I have these moments where I'm like, why am I just putting myself out there? You know, why should I keep making content or like do another blog post or whatever? And it's really because of the messages that I get from young girls and women in particular who are like, you know, I could really relate to that, or like, I didn't know that other people also went through that, or like, I'm facing this, you know, what's your advice? So all those messages are kind of like what keeps me motivated to just keep going and keep growing, you know?
That's so dope. How does that feel when you get some of those messages?
At first, I was like, you know, I'm not worthy, like I'm not deserving, you know, like there are other people that you should be going to that just know more and that have done more. But then, you know, I kind of started just feeling this responsibility of like, you know, they took the time out of their day to write to me and they were brave enough to, you know, message me with this thing that's very like personal to them and being vulnerable. So it's like I really have a responsibility that I placed on myself to, you know, take the time to respond to as many of them as I can. And yeah, it's just this sense of responsibility. You know, I'm the eldest of my siblings, so I kind of try to take on that role with, you know, whoever I talk to.
Yeah, no, that's really dope. And you probably already answered this question, but let me know if anything else comes up. You know, what's one thing that just continues to inspire and empower you to continue being that representation, continue being your most authentic self?
Yeah, I think aside from, you know, the people who message me about wanting to know more or getting involved in STEM, it's also the people that are already in it and are already, you know, doing stuff similar to what I'm doing. There's this big community of, you know, Latinos in STEM, Latinas in tech, all of those that I've kind of tapped into. And we have like, you know, our groups and our little sessions and, you know, just our safe spaces where we can just go and hang out and, you know, exchange ideas and collaborate. So they really keep me motivated, and just keep me like trying to be innovative in what I'm doing. So definitely I would say when I first started out, it was like, you know, I got to be this because there's nobody out here. But it's like now I'm like, no, we are out here. It's just about like putting it out there and, you know, crossing our audiences over and helping each other and, you know, networking and stuff. So yeah, I guess just growing the community is kind of what keeps me going.